welcome everyone from climate change to the coronavirus, land conservation as a critical societal need. Our presenter today really needs no introduction, but I'll give a very brief one. Tim Glidden is president of Maine Coast Heritage Trust. His short biography was on the website along, which you saw when you registered. Tim has spoken a number of times at events that I have organized, and one of the reasons why I so value his perspective is he's so well-rounded. I mean, he knows policy, he knows the politics, he knows the practical. And it's with that sort of range of skills and knowledge that he brings perspectives that are fresh and different. And I'm always delighted, and as are others, to hear what he has to say. So I'm going to turn it right over to Tim and for his presentation this evening. Tim.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. A virtual handoff is wonderful. Let me just quickly say that if I look off to my left, it's because I've got two screens here, one with a presentation in front of me and one with all of you. So when somebody is saying something to me, I may want to look at them because that's my instinct. And of course, that means I look away from the camera and I look away from you. So my apologies for that in advance, as they're just deeply entrenched habits. So I hope everybody has had a chance to at least either give up or make a guess on the questions, and I'll move us along to the next slide. A little prettier slide, same basic information. Wanting to talk to you tonight about land conservation as a critical societal need, and take a stab at some links, at least metaphorically, between climate change and coronavirus. So we'll see if that works. I always like to start with the sort of basic fundamental inspiration that I think is why at least I care about land conservation and the coast of Maine. It's places like this, places that inspire me, and I think places that inspire lots and lots of us to care about the natural world and find solace and sustenance in that just amazing place that we all have the good luck to live close to. At the same time, I also sometimes pop this slide up because I think it shows that God has a sense of humor. And this, I won't make this into another ice-breaking question, but this little island here in the middle of the screen actually is shaped that way. It is not photoshopped. And this is in Bucks Harbor, that's Harbor Island. And there's a great story behind the conservation of that island that MCHT was proud to be part of maybe 5 years ago. But there are amazing places along the Maine coast. So before we dive into the substance, let me get to that question that we started off with. And this, what was the most common island name along the coast? And we had Green Crow, Bar, and Ram Island. Well, so the answers are that Ram Island was the winner with literally 35 islands named Ram. So whoever got that gets the free membership at Wells Marine Reserve for the year. Isn't that right, Paul?
Yes, and MCHT, I think.
And MCHT, yeah.
It's a double.
Turnaround is fair play there. Ram Island, as probably most of you could easily guess, there's so many Ram Islands out there because back in the day when we kept a lot of sheep in Maine, islands were a very convenient place to keep those obstreperous male sheep who really were kind of difficult to corral and contain. But you put them out there on an island, there's not much they can do except get fatter, grow a lot of wool, and be ready for the next time the ewes need him. But there's also obviously lots of other islands out there with all those, just clusters up and down. I don't know what that says about the level of imagination of our foreparents, but at least they were consistent in their namings. So jumping into land conservation, I think let's start with where do we stand on coastal conservation in Maine? And I'll take a step back even a little bit more to, to talk a little bit about land conservation across the entire state. And without reading everything on the screen there for you, you can see that over the last 25 years, there has been an explosion of land conservation. It really has been a golden period of land conservation in Maine, going quadrupling over that 25-year period with all sorts of benefits that go along with that. And those benefits include access to water, obviously a lot of conserved land for farms. There's a lot of great efforts in York County from the local land trust down there, Great Works, York Land Trust, and many others that are just doing amazing work in that particular sphere, as well as wildlife habitat. But as you look at the map of Maine that I have up on the screen now, you can see that most of that acreage is really all up north. So that quadrupling we've been talking about, that was really driven by a wave of large working forest easements starting in, well, the very late 80s, but really the 90s, through the aughts, as I guess we awkwardly call them. And that work is ongoing. And if we were all in the room together, I would sort of call on you to shout out kind of what is the striking area that doesn't seem to have a lot of land conservation on it. And so in the absence of being able to get that shout out, I think you can easily see that, the question is, what about the coast? Even though there has been a lot of work on the coast, and here's a different view of it. Orientation here, you've got Mount Desert, the Portland area, the Wells Reserve down here, off into Washington County. To get substantial acreage that shows up on a map or that you would see from space, you really have to get down to Hancock County and into Washington County. So there is a lot of important work to do. But I think it would be fun to take a little spin up the coast, maybe west to east, and look at a few of those places, just a sampling, because we would be here all night. And while the eye candy is gorgeous, I don't want to sort of wear you out. So just a few of these pieces that I think you should be proud about and enjoy. I hope everybody who's on this call can identify this shot, even though it doesn't have a name. Everybody should be nodding their head if they recognize this. Yes, good. Thank you. Obviously, this is the Wells Reserve, or a piece of the Wells Reserve, and a part of Maine that is really quite different than every other part of the coast, and very special as a result of that. Moving up to Casco Bay, just as a quick hop and a skip and a jump, we're passing over lots of great work. But the Goslings are an amazing little cluster of islands that you might not be surprised to hear hang off the south end of Lower Goose Island. And of course, there's an Upper Goose Island. So between the two Geese Islands, we have a bunch of Goslings. And these lovely little islands are connected by a bar at low tide, and they're one of the most popular destinations in Casco Bay. Moving slightly further east, Paul and I were talking about this at the very, very beginning of the call. This is Woodward Point. It's on the New Meadows River, and it is in Brunswick, Maine. Brunswick has, I think it's true, the longest shoreline of any Maine town, and yet it has almost no public access to the water. So the addition of this parcel was really a big jump. And these waters are incredibly productive for clamming. There's oyster aquaculture up and down the New Meadows River, and these spectacular preserve here, these fields, right this minute are teeming with bobolinks. So those of you who are in the birding persuasion, I encourage you to get up to Woodward Point and enjoy this. Jumping a little further east to St. George and Tenants Harbor, we're about to acquire Clark Island, which is an amazing spot. It's one of the rare coastal islands in Maine that you can walk to at any tide. And that's because it has a causeway, and you can also bring a bathing suit in the summer, and there's quarries on the island to swim in. It's a really cool place, as you can see, to bring grandchildren. Aldermere Farm, a little different. MCHT's only active farm. We raise Belted Galloway here, but this is in Rockport. Just lovely, different part of the Maine coast. And then for those of you who are boaters of any persuasion, kayak, sail, or power, Merchant Row is a fabled destination for anybody who loves the ocean and the water. This happens to be Saddleback Island, but it's an amazing part of the coast with really, really wonderful archipelago of islands, many of which are conserved and many of which are open to public access, which is always an important part of the theme. An unnamed piece here, but this is Little Black Island. We're now just south of Mount Desert. And you can see between this and the prior slide, the change in the landscape of the granite outcrop and the look of the Maine coast that shows up on all the postcards. Another lovely spot to visit. Over on the Scudic Peninsula, this is a different kind of project. This is all freshwater here, but MCHT for the past 10 or 15 years, and it's going to take at least another 20, is creating a corridor for wildlife between the southern tip of the Scudic Peninsula, which is part of Acadia National Park, all the way up to the Tunk Lake Scudic Mountain area, which you see in the distance here. And this is a corridor that we think will be crucial as climate shifts and habitat gradients shift, and the fauna and probably to some extent flora need to migrate across that continuum. I would say this is a landscape that is inspired in some ways by the amazing work that's happening in the area that you folks may be more familiar with down around the reserve, and I'm referring to the Mount A to C project, which has been a spectacular project running for more than 20 years that is conserved, I think, and there's people on this call who know more than I do about this, has conserved something on the order of 20,000 acres in this area, and really a stunning achievement. So this is kind of inspired by that in an effort in a eastern part of the coast. And then finally, up in Washington County, although Maine Coast Heritage Trust is often associated directly with the salt, we also work in coastal towns that have fresh water. This is Rocky Lake. It's in the headwaters of the Orange River, which many of you may have never heard of, but it's one of the really amazing small coastal rivers that feeds into Cobscook Bay and generates some of the productivity that makes Cobscook Bay one of the most productive estuarine areas on the East Coast. So a lot has been accomplished, and this has only been the smallest of small tastes and only on the coast. So there's another whole set of presentations that we could get into thinking about what else has been accomplished, but we should all feel really good about that. And I hope you do, because you're supporting great organizations like your local trusts and the Wells Reserve. And yet, I always want to make the case that there is a lot more important work to do. This slide is just pointing out, and I'm going to be really clear about this so I don't mislead people, but excuse me, in terms of land that is actually owned by the public, in other words, owned by the government, state or federal, Maine ranks last amongst the New England states and ranks quite poorly nationally. You know, our national park is relatively small. We don't have a lot of national forest. The state park and public land system, while wonderful and creates many jewels across the state, is not really up to the standard that I think we need to achieve, both for the needs of the public, but also for the needs of the ecological function. Now, the good news in Maine, and this is true in other parts of the country as well, is that land trusts we have a vibrant land trust community in Maine. There's about more than 80, about 85 land trusts operating in Maine, and they work hard to fill that gap. So back at the beginning, probably a few of you were saying, wait a minute, he told us we were up to 20% of the state conserved. So you can see there, 6.5% of Maine is in public ownership. That is only what is owned outright. So all of those big easements you've heard about up north are on top of that figure. And all the land, the fee land held by land trusts is on top of that figure. But land trusts rely on private support. They're not part of the government. And in some ways that's a good thing. But in other ways, I think it's important for us to keep track of the fact that public support for public lands remains a critical goal that we need to be supporting. So let me move along. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was sort of musing over, because I was thinking about this while holed up in my office, and I haven't said that, but I am coming to you from my office in Topsom, Maine at my house. And whatever you see on the wall behind me, God help me, is kind of what hangs there every day. Nothing has been prettied up for this. But I was thinking about, so what are the lessons? What do we learn from the current situation that we might be able to take as a cue for further work? And I'd love to hear some ideas when we get to that part of the program. Clearly for me, the fact that preserve use has gone off the charts for many land trusts, and I suspect it's true for the land trusts down in York County. We are hearing from the public how much appreciation there is for the availability of these lands. Many of you may know that many of the most popular state parks were closed during the early days of the pandemic, and the beaches, many of the public beaches were being closed, and people really wanted to get outside. It is the healthy place to be. They turned to land trusts. The land trust community put a lot of effort into publicizing the availability of those lands, and for the most part, folks have used those lands very responsibly and safely. We have not had to close any of the MCHT's preserve. I have heard of some local land trusts who've had to get in there and actively manage. But to date, I think there's a real plus in that. Land trusts have also been stepping up to meet a whole range of other needs. And I won't name them all, but one of the obvious ones is that because many land trusts are running community gardens or agricultural operations, the production of local food has really brought sharp focus and understanding to the value of having your food close to where you live, produced close to where you live. And I think land trusts play a critical role in making that possible in many parts of the state. So the current conditions, I think, really are validating our efforts. And I hope, as I say there on the screen, that if you have ever been supporting the work of local land trusts or land conservation directly in your own life, I hope you feel very, very good about that because it has been incredibly valuable. What can we learn from the current situation? Now here I'm going to start to take a leap, so bear with me. Here are the kind of things I've been learning thinking about this, both personally in my own sort of interactions with the world around me and just observing how the rest of society has responded. I mean, the clear message is that nature is in charge. I said on the screen, you can't spin a virus. You can't talk it out of doing what it's going to do. It's also very clear, and we learned this from the sweep of this pandemic across the globe, that it is a global challenge, and that requires both local action and global action. And I would give the world a mixed grade on that front, and I wouldn't put this country in the top rank on that scorecard. But it's also clear, but it is clear that that local action is needed. It's also clear to me that the dynamics of these processes are incredibly complex. There is so much that we don't know. I mean, I suspect I share a experience with many of you that, one of the hardest things about the last 2.5 months has been the level of uncertainty, where every revelation of some new insight sort of opens up a new set of questions. Things that we thought we knew earlier turn out perhaps not to be quite so solid. And so the underpinnings of our understanding about how we manage a situation like this are extremely dynamic and complex. And it is all happening incredibly fast. And if there's a little bit of a hope, I would say in there, and I think there's more than a little bit, it's also been clear to me that when we are convinced that it really is a crisis, we can move quickly. And I think we see that in some countries more than others, or in some parts of this country more than others. But it's been reassuring to me that we have been able to do that. I'm obviously, there's lots of negatives that we can draw from this as well, but I'm looking for the lessons we might be able to turn a little bit towards the next stage. So let me turn to that next stage. What might we think about? If I can hit the right button or move the right roller, there we go. So I'm thinking about COVID as a metaphor. And I'm turning now to climate change, which is the issue that I really started with in land conservation, is to think about how what we do can address these big issues. So like COVID, climate change is a global crisis. It's interesting to me that both of these things started before we were really aware of them, and they swiftly have spun out of control. Now, very much on different time frames, and we'll talk about that. COVID has happened so quickly that we really feel that we understand that time frame. It's a very human time frame. It's weeks and months. Of course, it's going to be years and probably decades as well, but it's certainly weeks and months. And that threat is existential. We feel it viscerally, either personally or as a threat to our families and loved ones and friends and our community. And we see what's happening, what it's doing to the economy. My conclusion there, though, as I turn and try to think about this and pivot to climate change, is that on this time scale, I think that's the big challenge for humans. One of the real big issues that we wrestle with as we try to deal with the climate change message out to the broader public is to make it feel immediate, sufficiently urgent that people will act. Now, I've kind of stolen Aldo Leopold's line here about thinking like a mountain, and I'm intensely aware that there's some people in the audience who actually teach Aldo Leopold. So if I butcher it, please forgive me. But he talks about a variety of things in that. One of it is in thinking like a mountain, he was thinking about the interconnectedness of all the various parts of the ecological community that lived on that mountain, how they all interrelated, and how those relationships played out over time. That you could do something in one place, and the ripple, which you might not really be able to track, would go all through that system and come out in some other place. And unless you thought like a mountain, like the whole thing, you really couldn't keep track of it all. So I think one of the challenges for us then, thinking like a mountain is a nice metaphor, but if we're dealing with climate change, which is going to play out over decades and centuries, I as a forester, might make another suggestion, which is think about the state tree. The state tree in Maine is the white pine, the eastern white pine, which I think you're all probably pretty familiar with. Gorgeous tree, queen of the woods. It has a lifespan, I mean, give or take, obviously, of about 300 years. And that feels to me like a time span that even humans can wrap their brain around. It's, it's 2 or 3 generations. It's maybe, back to your grandparents and out to your great-grandchildren or grandchildren. You can kind of encompass that. And over that time frame, if that's the time frame we were thinking about, climate change is immediate. The white pines that are growing today will suffer the impact of climate change. So if we can get our heads into that frame of reference, I think we can move our neighbors to thinking along those lines, we might have some luck at getting stronger action on climate change. But circling back to this talk, because this talk is about land conservation, what is our role, or what are our roles as land conservationists? And I would suggest that in some ways, when we're thinking about land conservation, the first thing that we're really thinking about, the embracing goal that I feel we need to pursue, is to build the resilience of all of Maine, but particularly, speaking for MCHT, for the Maine Coast, build the resilience of these systems, of these communities, both natural and human, in the face of change. Going back to Leopold for a second, we need to be acting now to save the pieces for future generations. It's kind of the first rule, is to save those pieces. One of the things that we have learned in land conservation over the past 50 years, at least, and maybe longer, is that if you have all the pieces of productive systems in place, whatever the changes are in the future, you are more likely to have a productive system in the future. It may be a very different system, but if you're protecting the land itself, if you're protecting the interface between land and water, if you're protecting a gradient up an altitude, as is the case around Mount A to the sea, you are protecting sort of structural elements of our landscape that will be critical to sustaining the resilience of our state and our coast in the future. I also think as conservationists, we need to do everything we can to build trust in what I call sound science as a shorthand. I think we are suffering from a blight, another pandemic of scientific illiteracy in many ways. And it is going to be crucial for folks to have trust in what the facts of the real world are. Because if we don't trust that, we're going to get ourselves into even more trouble. And I think it's going to be important for us, from these existential issues, we also need to be taking care of our mental health, of our spiritual health. And I think it's been demonstrated quite clearly, both in the last 2 months and in the last 50 years, that open lands are critical to our well-being for the solace and inspiration that they bring to all of us, whether or not we are poets or simply plodders who get out there and need to hike and breathe some fresh air. We all get that kind of spiritual sustenance from nature and the open world. If we're doing all these things, we will be building stronger communities. And as we build those stronger communities, we will then be able to have working landscapes that support livelihoods for people. We will be able to have places where we can raise our kids, inspire them, get outside, get that next generation going, and I guess even provide a place for a few pets. And we will also have places for ourselves to get away, really connect with the natural world, get that inspiration for our souls so that we can move into the future that we all want to be in, which is strong, resilient, sustainable, and healthy. That's what MCHT is committed to doing. That's the work we've been doing for about 50 years along the coast. I haven't said this yet, but it is our 50th anniversary this year. I tell you, it's a hell of a celebration to have to go into lockdown when you're trying to celebrate 50 years of work, but there it is. We all do it. And with that, I would thank you very much for your attention. And I would hand the mantle back to Paul.
Yeah, great. Well, Tim, thank you very much. And I think everyone is clapping virtually at your performance and your presentation. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. So now we have some time for questions. You can pose your questions in the chat box. I believe one person has joined us by phone, so we will get to that. So please, if you have questions for Tim, related to what he has talked about or something else related to conservation, please begin. So if you don't mind, I would like to have a lead-off question for you, Tim. As you rightly noted in your presentation, there has been an upsurge in use of protected places. And I know at this place at the Wells Reserve, people were massively grateful and appreciative that we were open and accessible. We had these open spaces and beautiful landscapes for people to get away. And I think the challenge for us is, how does that translate into support for what we do? Because this didn't come free. It took a lot of work. It took a lot of money. It took a lot of support. And in order for us to continue on this path, because we're going to need more land in the future, that is our challenge. How does that translate into support? How do we keep people focused so that when the pandemic does gradually get better, dissipates, if you will, how do we keep that enthusiasm for the places that meant so much for people when they needed us most?
Yep.
So any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a good question. Initially, the feedback that I am getting both directly at MCHT, but also in talking to our sister land trusts throughout the state, is that they are being contacted by people they do not know, thanking them for the availability of these lands and even sending in checks. So in a sense, there is an initial wave of enthusiasm that I think it'd be really important to capitalize on that, to capture it. I guess my broader response would be, I think there's going to be a lot of really wonderful stories that come out of what is otherwise, in some senses, a pretty dark period. Stories of people helping each other, stories of how a land trust was able to step in and meet the needs of the communities that it serves, either, as you were saying, through the availability of these lands, but also maybe of, well, they decided to plow up that lot and turn it into a community garden. And I think capturing those stories and retelling those stories again in the years ahead is at least one way to capture and sustain what I think is a current high level of awareness and consciousness.
Great. Thank you. So I'd like to invite others to ask a question. Annie, is there anyone in?
I see Tin just put up his, Tin Smith, if he unmute Tin.
I did. I agree with you, Tim, about the good stories to tell. But one of the things I'm running into is, how do you communicate that to the community to build a strong community? It seems that our information sources have been tremendously fragmented, and it's very difficult. I mean, you used to be able to put an article in the newspaper, and you'd get most of the people in a community. And now you can no longer do that. And I think that that's part of the struggle that I'm seeing is, how do you communicate your message? You have your membership, but you're not reaching past that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I don't know if that's an answerable question, but.
I
That's
don't
what I
think
think
there's
of.
I don't think there's any easy answer to that question. Sure, the channels of media now are fragmented down into sort of little micro slices. The folk we wrestle with that issue ourselves, but the people that I see that are being very successful in that have done two basic things. They've been on social media in a big way, and they've been very creative in how, and I don't view myself as creative on social media. I've got way too much of this gray stuff that I see on top of your head too, to really be adept in that. But the organizations that have really been able to hook that are plugging in with a younger generation, but not just in teenagers in high school, but up into 20s and 30s. That ripples out into their families, and that's been very, very effective. And the other thing is the kind of stuff we can't do right now because we're all not supposed to get together. Is I think it's engaging communities at an ever increasing level of intimacy, which is basically being present in the community in more and more ways. And that takes a lot of work, as you well know. There's only so many volunteer hours in the day, and yet that is, if you get to people, it's the people-to-people connections that's going to amplify the message the most. And I would guess the third thing I would throw in there is doing the projects which have the very high visibility that lots and lots of people use. Just as an example, the Woodward Point project that I showed a picture of 25 minutes ago was not a known place in the community. And when we opened that place up, people have flocked to it. And within a single year, the use has really gone up. And I can't walk down the street in Brunswick. I happen to live in Topsom, right across the river from Brunswick, which is where this is. And I can't walk down the street in Brunswick without people coming up to me and saying, I can't believe you helped save that place. Thank you so much for that effort. And these are not people I know, but they've gotten some wind of it some other way. So I think it's hard work, and I think it hard but necessary. Sorry, no silver bullet.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. Other questions for Tim? Andy, do you see any hands up?
No, I do not. Anyone literally raise their hand? Oh, we've got Kathleen Ivanovsky.
And Owen too, next, after that.
Good job on that. You were mentioning that there are some groups who are using social media effectively to reach those teens and 20s. Can you give me an example of one of those groups? Because I'd love to do some research and see what approaches they're taking.
So the individual campaign that I saw that impressed me was actually at the Kittery Land Trust. And it was a blend of almost some guerrilla theater and then social media. And I mean, it was kind of a seamless marketing effort. And I'm not going to remember what the project was, but they used cows. And people were out in cow costumes, by rotaries and just making people curious. And then they were pushing out through social media these kind of blurbs and little contests and things like that. And all of it played together in a way that raised consciousness for this particular project they were fundraising for in a very effective way. And they seemed to do just a fabulous job. The Brunswick Topsom Land Trust, I think that I happen to be a member of the Brunswick Topsom Land Trust because it's my home land trust. I'm duty bound to do that. I think they do a very good job as well. Their efforts are less interactive and more informative, but they have so many different offerings and they're putting out so many different elements of that I think there's it's like a something for everybody piece that gets people paying attention.
Okay.
It's hard to push something which is, you can't be too, what's the right word? Owen's watching here, but too didactic about this. You know, you're not really going to drill a sophisticated, complicated, better word, message in on people. You're just trying to hook their interest, get them to connect with you so that you can engage more deeply.
Okay,
Excuse
thank you.
me.
Other questions? Raise your hand.
Owen had his hand up, I think, at one point.
Owen?
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to see you guys, and thanks for doing this. One thought I had, just as listening to Tim talk about the amount of visitation is signage that could go at trailheads that would give an additional message. If you're glad you have this right now, here's what you can do. You know, and maybe just for the perception of it, something slapped on top of another bulletin board. The question I have is, in Wells, we have an acquisition project coming up, and in Wells, we're not a land trust. TINS represents the Great Works Land Trust. So Conservation Commission, the town of Wells buys conservation land, and we have a purchase on the ballot. And the election has been pushed back, I think, more than a month. And the Biddeford newspaper folded, okay? The local throwaway newspaper quit publishing. So I'm at a loss as to how to put the message out for people to vote in favor of this acquisition project. It will be on the town warrant. And it's a wonderful piece of land. We've worked tirelessly to get it together. It's a bargain sale, the whole thing. And I mean, it's really good purchase. I don't know how to get the word out other than the idea that I spoke of just a moment ago that I just thought of is we could get some signage at all our trailheads and say, you know, if you like this, make sure you vote and get 50 of your closest friends to vote. Put that into a, you know, an acceptable message somehow.
Yep.
I see Keith is here, so I'm going to embarrass him by saying Keith has been absolutely tireless in this acquisition. He deserves the thanks, everybody in town. He has my thanks now. He has done enormously good work in some difficult circumstances, okay? He's been right at it. He hasn't missed a trick. So credit where credit's due. So if anybody has any ideas, I mean, how, we're a member of the Chamber of Commerce, oddly enough. The Conservation Commission is a member of the Chamber of Commerce. That seemed like a good idea a few years ago. So I'm getting constant messages from the head of the Chamber of Commerce, you know, it's, when are we going to get the tourists back, you know, and start that routine, which is fine. You know, these people got to make a living like everybody else. And, you know, that person's done a good job keeping people informed. So I'm wondering if maybe I just, it doesn't say no reply on her message, you know, so maybe I just send one back that way when it comes in and say, you know, here is an alternative to the beaches in town. I have a bit of a reluctance to do that. Early in the pandemic, we thought about whether we should advertise that our conservation lands are open. And in a way, that, like a lot of conservation lands that we all care for, they're very huge pieces of land. You can get off the trail and you won't see anybody in days if you just step off the trail. So in a sense, there's a huge potential there for solitariness and great safety in being outside, being able to just step off that trail, take your compass, you know. On the other hand, like I live at Elk Pond, there have been cars at Elk Pond. They didn't close the beach there. There've been cars from like 5 different states in my neighborhood. So I guess I'm a little worried about places being overrun in that respect, living, you know, in the coastal tourist town. There's a great deal of uncertainty about a lot of things these days, and that's one thing I'm uncertain about. But I'd welcome if anybody has other thoughts about how we can get the word out. We have some listservs of people who have been friends of conservation in town. And I am absolutely, you know, not involved with social media. I don't do Facebook or any of those things. Never have no desire.
I'm
to do
shocked,
any of
Owen.
it. See, I don't have the white stuff. There's nothing there at all, mostly, top of my head. Thank you.
I don't have, your question in some ways is a cousin of Tin's question about
Yeah.
how to get the word out. In that particular instance, I don't know if there is an angel in town who would help you do a mailer that would basically get into everybody's mailbox with just a single, thin, colorful, positive message. In some senses, the timing couldn't be better for people to get that, because the reminder of the value of open lands at a time when people are hungry for those open lands would be great timing. But it would require both some time and effort and a couple $1,000 to pull something like that together. But I see Al Reed, you have your hand up over there in the corner. You need to unmute.
York Land Trust has had several bond proposals in front of the town, and they've all been very successful. For each one, we have gone to the town and asked for a mailing list of the people who always vote, which they have very happily donated, and sent a postcard, just the way Tim was describing. Beautiful picture, little description with the article number on it, but we don't try to get everybody, that's too expensive, but just the ones who always come to the polls. And that has been extremely, I think, helpful. Just to, people arrive at the polls holding it, I gotta vote for this one.
Thanks very much.
Good advice there. Good advice.
But you're able to get from the town clerk's office list of people who tend to vote as opposed to just the rolls.
Exactly, it's much cheaper.
And that's like a standard thing one could ask for a town clerk?
Yes.
Thank you. That's really a good idea. Thank you very much.
Other questions for Tim?
Literal hand here.
All right. Hey, Alan, how you doing?
Hi, good, thanks, Paul.
Good, good. Please proceed.
Good to see everybody here. Thank you. It's inspiring, William. I really appreciated your comment from using all the Leopold about it, thinking like a mountain. It's obviously everything takes time, and that's, in my view, it's part of what's been some of the problem in that there's been for the last 50 years, and this is also, unfortunately, we didn't have an Earth Day celebration as well, but everyone's there. The corridors of power are used to getting things much more quickly. That's the way the business cycle works. It's the quarter or the month, as opposed to 10 years, 5 years, 30 years, 50 years. And we seem to be in a moment where there's an opportunity to try and get the word out beyond the, 22 people that are here and the many more that support it. It's almost speaking to the choir here. And part of getting through that wall, that wall is making the message relevant to the economics of their livelihoods. And you did mention that some jobs could be created by the conservation, and that's wonderful. I'd like to see more of that. But there are, with the current political climate and the diminishing of environmental protections, the message, and it's not just getting the message out. I think this message itself needs to be amplified, tweaked, so it can break through that to those that don't necessarily have the same values that many of the people here have.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I did not emphasize that much the economic element of this, probably just because my head is more in almost the public health and the
Sure.
mental health side of things these days. But you're absolutely right. The key insight that I take from your comment there is that in order to connect a conservation message to the person in the street, whoever that person may be, who's outside of the choir, there has to be a sort of that relevance connection. Why is this relevant to me? I'm being bombarded with, 50 other things every day,
Right.
including a lot of bad news. Why should I pay attention to this? So I think land trusts have a bit of an advantage there, though, in the sense that, especially in your area, the land trusts are established. They're known in the communities. They are, by and large, trusted organizations in those communities, and they have done a good job at making connections between people's well-being and the availability of these lands, whether it be for agricultural lands or hiking, productive clamming spots. We spend a lot of time thinking about clammer access. So any ways, or just getting kids out onto the land, relationships with local schools, anything that connects a land trust and their activities to somebody's day-to-day life makes that connection. And that's what you have to build on. It happens slowly, but fortunately, you guys have all been at it for quite a while. And probably, I'm just sort of looking around here, probably need to bring in a little younger blood here and there. But that's, I think, a crucial part of the response to your question, Alan, or your observation, really more.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alan. Other questions? I am unable to see raised hands, but you guys are. Tim and Annie, do you see anyone raising their hand, their virtual hand?
Ginger, did you pop your hand up? Or no, okay.
All right.
I thought you did for a second there.
There's someone on the phone, Annie, that you had mentioned.
Yes, there's a 857 number.
Yeah.
If they wanted to unmute, they could.
Question from the phone? No. Okay. Well, very good. I think we're coming to the end here. When Annie, Tim, and I were putting this presentation together, it was Annie's directive that I have to say something inspiring at the end. And awfully difficult for me to do that when I follow someone like Tim Glidden. So the only thing I can do is throw an Aldo Leopold quote back at you all. And one of the great things he says is, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." So I think in these times, what we've gone through in the last 2.5, 3 months or so, and as we face a much longer term crisis in climate change, we should always keep Aldo Leopold upmost in mind, because what he said back in the 1930s just validates what we are doing today. So I would like to thank Tim once again, and for all of you to participate, and Annie Cox for her assistance on this. And with that, I look forward to seeing you all at some other event or activity. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I really appreciate your attention and the time.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Paul.
Welcome.
Bye-bye.